President, Mr. Speaker, members of Congress, representatives of the American people across all states, territories, cities, and communities. I would like, if I may, to take this opportunity to express my particular gratitude to you all for the great honor of addressing this joint meeting of Congress.
King Charles makes huge announcement after Parliament reveals Camilla's secret royal decree forgery. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title points to something far more serious than an embarrassing royal document. Parliament had reportedly placed a disputed decree under scrutiny after investigators found signs that a document carrying what appeared to be royal authorization had been altered or improperly authenticated. The document was connected to Camilla's circle, and its implications reached directly into the balance of decision-making inside the royal family. Charles was confronted with a document that appeared to give Camilla unprecedented authority over an important royal decision, despite the central claim that he had never personally approved those powers. The allegation was that the authority of the king himself had been placed on a document without his genuine approval. And William was not merely watching from the sidelines. The story presented to investigators suggested that an internal objection connected to him had disappeared from the record before the disputed decree moved through the approval process. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether someone had made a mistake. The question was who had altered the trail, who had benefited from the change, and who believed nobody would notice. Hi viewers, if a document appeared to give one person power that the king never approved, would you speak up if you discovered it, or would you stay silent and let it pass? Put your answer in the comments. And if you believe royal authority should never be used behind closed doors without accountability, subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who follows these stories.
Someone you didn't know?
Somebody I didn't know. I was reading my book, and this man attacked me, and I did fight back, and I got off. I remember getting off the train, and my mother looking at me and saying, why is your hair standing on end, and why is the button missing from your coat? And
oh gosh, so it was physical.
I've been attacked, but I remember anger.
Silence only helps when nobody is willing to look closer. Inside the parliamentary file, the disputed decree stood out because of what it appeared to authorize. The wording suggested a level of decision-making power that could significantly change who controlled the matter under investigation. Yet the approval trail did not sit comfortably beside the document. Dates, correspondence, signatures, and internal records raised questions that could not be dismissed as a simple administrative oversight. Then came the detail that reportedly stopped the room cold: the signature. It appeared to carry Charles's authority, but the circumstances surrounding it raised immediate doubts. Palace lawyers were said to have begun comparing it against authenticated examples, while investigators examined correspondence and confidential approval records to determine whether the document had actually passed through the process it claimed to have followed. One record appeared to suggest that the disputed authorization had been treated as valid even though the king's position had supposedly been different. Another part of the file raised questions about an internal objection connected to William. If that objection had really been removed, then someone had potentially changed the evidence surrounding it. A forged signature creates one crisis. A manipulated approval trail creates another. If both appeared together, the possibility of a coordinated effort became impossible to dismiss. And that was where Camilla's position became increasingly uncomfortable. Her connection to the administrative process did not, by itself, prove that she had created or ordered any forgery. But the disputed decree was connected to her circle, and investigators were reportedly examining whether people around her had been involved in moving the paperwork forward. The document questioned whether someone had used the king's authority to create a decision he never knowingly made. Charles reportedly studied the disputed paperwork while the allegations gathered force around him. The crucial issue was whether the people responsible for moving it through the system knew that something was wrong. And there was another problem waiting inside the file: William's objection. If the objection had genuinely disappeared before the final review, then the person behind the alteration may have known exactly which piece of information needed to be removed before the document reached the people who could stop it.
Being missed. The statistics speak with stark clarity. To take just one example, when bowel cancer is caught at the earliest stage, around 9 in 10 people survive for at least 5 years. When diagnosed late, that falls to just 1 in 10.
That changed the entire shape of the case. A document can be challenged. A missing document is harder to explain. And if the missing objection and disputed royal authorization were connected, then the palace was no longer facing a single suspicious decree. It was facing the possibility that someone had deliberately engineered the appearance of approval. According to the story, Charles could no longer remain silent any longer. The next step would be a reconstruction of exactly how the decree moved, who touched it, which approval appeared when, and why William's objection was no longer where it should have been. And once that trail began pointing toward people inside Camilla's own circle, the question became much more dangerous than who forged a signature. It became who had been controlling the story from inside the palace. If that question matters to you, do not scroll away now, because the next part reveals the document that could show exactly where this alleged deception began. The document did not begin with Parliament. It began months earlier, inside a private meeting at Windsor, where the decision that later became the center of the controversy was supposed to end quietly. 3 months before the parliamentary file was opened, Charles, Camilla, and William were already divided over the proposed change. The issue was not a ceremonial detail. It concerned control and decision-making connected to a royal-linked estate arrangement, and the proposed restructuring had the potential to change who could influence important decisions. Camilla's position was that the existing arrangement had become difficult to manage. A revised structure, in her view, could make decisions faster and remove administrative obstacles. William saw the same proposal differently. He believed the restrictions existed for a reason, particularly when royal-linked interests were involved. The disagreement sharpened because William was not challenging a routine administrative adjustment. He was challenging a change that could later be interpreted as an expansion of influence around Camilla's office. That possibility made him cautious, and his caution made the meeting increasingly tense. Charles was caught between them. The king had to weigh his wife's argument for a more practical arrangement against his son's concern that the crown's assets and authority required stronger safeguards. Neither side appeared willing to surrender the point. The longer the discussion continued, the clearer it became that this was no longer simply an argument over administration. Then Charles made the decision that should have settled the matter. He stopped the discussion and ordered that nothing proceed without his written approval. That instruction became the most important fact in the entire later investigation. It meant there was a clear line between what had been discussed and what had actually been authorized. The proposal could be considered. It could be revised. It could even return for another review, but it could not legitimately move forward on the basis of an assumption. William understood the instruction as a firm rejection of the immediate proposal. Camilla left the meeting knowing that Charles had not given the written consent required for the change. At that point, the dispute should have ended. Instead, the paperwork came back. The revised material appeared inside the administrative process, carrying authorization that suggested the king's position had changed. The difference was not simply a new paragraph or an altered recommendation. The crucial change concerned the authority attached to the document itself. Someone had created the appearance that the obstacle had been removed. That was when the earlier Windsor meeting became critical. Without that meeting, the disputed decree could be explained as confusion, poor communication, or an administrative misunderstanding. With the meeting documented, the question became much harder. Charles had already said no without written approval, so how did a later document appear to say yes? The answer depended on the paper trail. Investigators examining the process reportedly began comparing the original proposal with the revised version. The changes had to be traced carefully because a document could pass through several offices before reaching a final approval stage,
which pose immense challenges for the international community and whose impact is felt in communities the length and breadth of our own countries. We meet too in the aftermath of the incident not far from this great building that sought to harm the leadership of your nation and to foment wider fear and discord.
Every movement mattered, every notation mattered, every date mattered. The first major concern was the missing objection. William's formal concern was no longer sitting where investigators expected to find it. That mattered because an objection inside an approval file creates a visible record that a decision was contested. Removing it changes the story presented to whoever reviews the document later. The disappearance therefore raised a straightforward question: who removed it? The answer could not be found by looking only at the final decree. Investigators had to reconstruct what existed before the document reached its final form. That meant examining earlier drafts, internal memoranda, routing notes, correspondence, and records showing who handled the material. The deeper they went, the less convincing a simple clerical explanation became. There was another problem. The disputed authorization appeared to depend on the same chain of administration through which the missing objection had moved. That did not prove that the same person altered everything, but it meant the two irregularities could no longer be examined separately. One record suggested that an objection had disappeared. Another suggested that royal authorization had appeared where it should not have. Together, they created a much more serious possibility. The approval process itself may have been manipulated. This was also where the pressure around Camilla increased. Her office had been connected to the proposed restructuring, and investigators were reportedly examining communications from people working within that administrative circle. But the evidence still did not establish that Camilla personally created the disputed authorization. That distinction mattered. A person can support a proposal without forging an approval. A person can ask for an update without knowing that a document has been falsified. A person can even receive information that appears official and still be unaware that someone upstream has manipulated it. The investigation, therefore, had to determine not only who benefited from the decree, but who controlled the information moving between the people involved. That question became more important when another communication surfaced. Camilla's side had apparently continued seeking information about the proposal after Charles had ordered that nothing proceed without his written approval. That did not prove that she knew the king's authorization was false. It did, however, create an uncomfortable gap between what Charles believed had happened and what her office appeared to believe was still possible. For Charles, that gap was difficult to ignore. If Camilla believed the matter was still alive, why had the king not been told? If someone had told her that the proposal could proceed, who had given her that information? And if the information was wrong, who had an interest in keeping both sides apart? The investigation was now moving beyond signatures. It was moving into the flow of information. That was dangerous, because royal decision-making depends on people knowing which instructions are genuine and which are not. If a senior official can make one person believe that an approval exists while another person believes it does not, the paperwork can create an entirely false reality. The disputed decree may have been the visible object at the center of the controversy. The real mechanism could have been the information surrounding it. Investigators reportedly began examining whether the routing records had been altered to make the process appear legitimate. A routing record is important because it can show where a document went, when it moved, and which office handled it. If those details are accurate, they help establish a reliable chain. If they are manipulated, the chain itself becomes misleading. That possibility raised the stakes again. The person responsible would not necessarily need to control the entire palace. They would only need enough access to influence the critical points. The missing objection, the approval record, the communication sent to Camilla, the timing of each step. If one person had access to all four, then the apparent confusion could begin to look deliberate. William's role became important again because he had challenged the original proposal before the disputed authorization appeared. His objection was therefore not an afterthought. It was one of the earliest warnings in the chain. The more investigators reconstructed the sequence, the more significant that warning became. Someone had not simply produced a questionable document. Someone may have removed the person who questioned the proposal from the official record. And that meant the next stage of the investigation would have to go deeper into Camilla's own administrative circle, where the paper trail could reveal whether she had been directing the process, being protected by it, or being misled by someone who understood exactly how the palace operated. Before moving into that evidence, it is worth remembering what was now at stake. This was no longer only about whether a royal decree carried an authentic signature. It concerned whether internal safeguards could be bypassed, whether a senior member of the royal family could be kept unaware of another decision, and whether the crown's own approval system could be made to say something the king had never actually said. That is why this case became so dangerous. The next evidence would not merely raise suspicion around Camilla's office. It would begin to show how someone could manipulate the information reaching her while simultaneously creating the appearance that Charles had approved the very decision he had stopped. The troubling possibility was now clear. If the decree appeared after Charles's refusal and William's objection vanished before review, somebody may have understood the king's instruction and decided it could be overcome through paperwork and controlled information. That possibility would soon place everyone involved under far more serious scrutiny, and the next records could reveal who had that access all along. If you believe a royal signature should never be used to silence an objection or manufacture authority, do not look away now. Stay with this story, because the next part takes the investigation inside the circle closest to Camilla, and what investigators reportedly found there makes the entire controversy far more difficult to dismiss. Source basis for the Windsor sequence and the disputed approval trail. The first message changed the direction of the investigation. It did not come from Parliament, it did not come from William, it came from inside the administrative circle surrounding Camilla, and its wording created a problem that could not be explained away as a missing file or a damaged signature. The message indicated that royal authorization had been secured. That single claim mattered because Charles had not given the written approval required for the proposal to move forward. If the message was genuine, then something had changed. If it was false, then someone had deliberately created a belief inside Camilla's office that the king had reversed himself. Investigators reportedly began treating the correspondence as a key piece of evidence. They were no longer asking only who had touched the disputed decree, they were asking who had controlled the information reaching the people expected to act on it. That distinction was critical. A person trying to forge a royal authorization would need access to the document. A person trying to make that forgery succeed would need something more. They would need other people to believe the authorization was legitimate. And that meant the investigation had entered a more dangerous stage. The correspondence suggested that Camilla's office had continued monitoring the proposed restructuring. That fact alone did not establish wrongdoing. It showed that the proposal remained active in the minds of people around her, even though Charles had believed his refusal had stopped it. Then investigators reportedly found a request for an update from Camilla's administrative side. The timing drew attention. The request came after Charles had already rejected the proposal unless he provided written consent. Yet the wording suggested that the matter was still being followed. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Camilla may have believed the decision was being resolved through normal channels, or she may have known more than she had disclosed. At that stage, investigators could not assume either explanation. They needed the reply. When that reply was examined, the case shifted again. The communication indicated that royal authorization had been secured. For Camilla, such a message would have carried obvious weight. A royal approval could allow officials to continue a process that otherwise should have remained suspended. But for Charles, the message created a direct contradiction. He had not knowingly supplied the approval described in the correspondence. Now there were two competing versions of reality inside the same administrative system. One version said the king had stopped the proposal. The other appeared to say the king had approved it. Both could not be true. Investigators reportedly began tracing the person responsible for sending the message. That search required more than reading names at the bottom of emails or memoranda. They had to examine access records and determine who could see the relevant files, who could communicate with Camilla's office, and who could influence the routing of the disputed decree. The investigation was beginning to resemble a reconstruction of a controlled information system. Someone had to know that Charles had refused the proposal. Someone had to know that Camilla's side wanted clarity on its status. Someone had to be capable of communicating that approval existed. And someone had to be positioned close enough to the paperwork for the false authorization to survive. The same pattern appeared again when investigators examined William's missing objection. The objection had represented a direct challenge to the proposed change. Once it disappeared, the final file became easier to interpret as uncontested. That did not prove the person who removed it had also created the disputed authorization, but it demonstrated that the administrative record had been altered in a way that benefited the proposal. That was enough to make the next question unavoidable. Who had access to both sides of the process? That official became important because the position appeared to provide proximity to several stages of the process. The person could potentially see correspondence moving between offices, understand the status of approvals, and influence how documents were routed. The significance was not the title alone, it was the access. A forged authorization can be detected when someone compares it against an authentic signature. A manipulated process can be harder to detect because every individual step may appear ordinary when viewed separately. One person sends a message, another person updates a file, another person routes a document, another person assumes approval has already been granted. By the time the paperwork reaches the final stage, nobody may be looking at the entire chain. That possibility gave the investigation its real urgency. If someone had exploited the gaps between those offices, the disputed decree would not have required everyone involved to participate in the deception. Some people might simply have acted on information they believed was genuine. That possibility also changed the question surrounding Camilla. The evidence being examined did not automatically show that she had ordered a forgery. It suggested something more complicated. She may have supported the underlying restructuring, while someone else manipulated the process that allowed it to advance. But that did not make her responsibility disappear. If she had received information claiming that Charles had approved the proposal, the obvious question remained, why was that information accepted without direct confirmation from the king? That question would become deeply personal once Charles saw the correspondence. The palace now faced a difficult distinction between deliberate deception and poor judgment. Camilla could potentially be cleared of creating the false authorization while still being criticized for accepting a convenient reversal without checking it. That distinction would later become central to the confrontation between the king and queen consort. Before that confrontation, however, investigators reportedly found another piece of evidence: the routing information. The record appeared to show how the disputed paperwork moved through the administrative chain. If accurate, it should have demonstrated that the necessary checks occurred in sequence. But the chronology did not sit comfortably with the earlier instruction from Charles. A date associated with the routing process appeared inconsistent with the sequence of decisions surrounding the proposal. That mattered because changing the date of a document can change the apparent order of events. A later approval can be made to look earlier. A delayed objection can appear irrelevant. A document that should have stopped can appear to have passed normally. The investigators therefore had to ask whether the chronology itself had been manipulated. The deeper they went, the more the same concern kept returning. This was not simply about one piece of paper. It was about the appearance of legitimacy. Someone may have been trying to make a disputed decision look routine by controlling what appeared in the file, what disappeared from it, and what people were told outside it. That was the point at which the alleged forgery became a much larger institutional problem. The crown depends on trust in records because royal decisions cannot operate entirely on personal memory. Written approvals, official correspondence, and administrative checks exist so that major decisions can be verified later. If those safeguards are manipulated, the system becomes vulnerable even when the people at the top believe they are following the rules. And that was precisely what made the situation dangerous for Charles. He was not simply dealing with a document carrying questionable authority. He was confronting the possibility that people inside the system had been able to manufacture the appearance of his approval without immediately being detected. William understood the danger as well. His earlier objection now looked less like a disagreement and more like a warning that someone had wanted removed. The disappearance of that objection suggested that the process had not merely ignored resistance. It may have been designed to make the resistance invisible. Then investigators connected another point. The senior official under scrutiny appeared in records associated with the disputed authorization and the communication that told Camilla approval had been secured. That did not by itself prove the entire case, but it placed the same person near two of the most important contradictions. The investigation now had a possible pathway. Charles refused. William objected. The objection disappeared. The process continued. Camilla received information indicating that royal authorization existed, and the disputed document emerged carrying authority Charles said he had not granted. For the first time, the sequence could be viewed as one chain rather than a collection of unrelated irregularities. The implications were severe. If the official had manipulated the process, the person may have been exploiting the differences between family members rather than openly confronting any of them. Charles believed the matter was stopped. William believed his objection remained part of the record. Camilla believed the approval information she received was genuine. Each person could therefore be acting on a different version of the same decision. That was the kind of confusion that could allow a carefully planned deception to survive. The palace could no longer afford to treat the issue as an embarrassing administrative dispute. The investigation had reached the point where private conversations, internal correspondence, and access records all mattered. And Charles was about to see the evidence that would force him to confront the person at the center of the controversy. The next discovery would put the king and Camilla in the same room with the evidence between them, and what Charles learned there would make the disputed decree far more personal. If you believe powerful people should not be allowed to hide behind paperwork, stay with this story and make your voice count by liking, sharing, and subscribing, because the next part is where the evidence stops pointing at a document and starts pointing at the people behind it. The room changed the moment Charles placed the correspondence in front of Camilla. There was no audience, no cameras, no parliamentary officials waiting to explain what the papers meant. There was only the king, the queen consort, and a document that appeared to connect her office to an authorization Charles said he had never given. Camilla read the first lines without speaking. Then she reached the message that claimed royal approval had been secured. That was the moment the dispute stopped being an administrative problem and became a question of trust inside the marriage. Charles wanted one answer. Had she known? Camilla denied ordering any false signature. She denied instructing anyone to reproduce the king's name. But the evidence had created a different problem. She had continued to follow the proposal after Charles believed it was stopped, and she had accepted information saying that he had changed his mind. The distinction mattered, but it did not remove the damage. Charles could believe that Camilla had not forged his authorization and still question why she had not come directly to him. The king was no longer asking whether the decree was genuine. He was asking whether the person closest to him had trusted an administrative message more than his own instruction. Camilla reportedly insisted that she believed the information reaching her was legitimate. She had understood that the proposal was still moving through normal channels. If that account was accurate, then she had not knowingly participated in a forgery. She had, however, accepted a decision that should have been confirmed personally. Charles then turned to another document. It concerned William. The missing objection was back in view, and its significance was becoming harder to avoid. William had challenged the proposal before the disputed authorization appeared. His concern had been recorded, yet the objection later disappeared from the material being used to advance the decision. Camilla reportedly said she had never seen the missing memorandum. That statement created another opening in the investigation. If she had never seen it, who had removed it, and why? Charles now had to consider two possibilities at once. Someone may have been protecting Camilla from information that could have stopped the proposal, or someone may have been manipulating Camilla as part of a larger plan. Either possibility was serious. Neither could be resolved by protecting the family from scrutiny. That was why William pressed for the investigation to continue. The prince understood something his father could not afford to ignore. If the evidence was stopped because it touched Camilla, the monarchy would look as though family loyalty mattered more than accountability. If the investigation continued, private palace relationships could be exposed. There was no painless option. Charles chose the investigation. He authorized deeper examination of the administrative records, including access information surrounding the disputed decree. That decision changed the balance of power inside the case. Investigators were no longer limited to what appeared on the documents. They could examine how those documents had been handled. A senior official appeared across several critical stages of the process. The person had access to the administrative material surrounding the disputed authorization. The same official was connected to the records through which William's objection had disappeared and the communication that informed Camilla that royal approval had supposedly been secured. One connection could be coincidence. Two could be troubling. Three required a serious explanation. Investigators reportedly began comparing access records against the chronology of the disputed decree. They wanted to know who had opened the relevant files, who had altered or routed information, and who had been positioned to influence what different members of the royal family believed. The emerging picture was not simple. It suggested that the apparent deception could have depended on information being divided between different people. Charles believed one decision had been made. William believed his objection remained part of the record. Camilla believed she had been told that Charles had reversed his position. If one official had helped create those separate understandings, the person would not have needed to control every action. The deception could survive because each individual was responding to a different version of the truth. That possibility changed how investigators viewed Camilla's continued involvement. Her interest in the proposal could still be questioned. She had wanted the restructuring to progress. She had not independently confirmed the supposed reversal with Charles, but the correspondence could also support her claim that she believed the authorization was genuine. For Charles, that was an uncomfortable conclusion. His wife might not have created the false authorization. She might have been deceived by the same system that had misused his authority. But being deceived did not mean every decision she made was beyond criticism. He could accept that the evidence did not establish that Camilla personally forged his signature. He could also accept that she had made a serious judgment error by failing to verify a decision that directly contradicted his earlier instruction. Camilla, in turn, reportedly acknowledged that she should have asked Charles directly. That admission did not close the case. It made the case more painful. Because now the question was not simply who had forged the decree, it was why an official would want Camilla to believe Charles had approved it. The answer could be hidden in the proposed powers themselves. The disputed decree appeared to give Camilla an unusually broad role in decision-making connected to the arrangement under review. That meant the person manipulating the process was not merely trying to settle an old disagreement. The person may have been trying to create a new structure in which Camilla could exercise authority that William had opposed. That raised the stakes dramatically. If the decree succeeded, the result could have been presented as a legitimate royal decision. If it failed, the person behind it could blame confusion. The safest position for an insider would have been to make every participant believe someone else had already approved the move. That was precisely why the false message to Camilla mattered. It potentially provided the missing bridge between the forged authorization and the action that followed. Investigators reportedly traced the communication back toward the senior official already appearing in the administrative records. Then another problem surfaced. The official had access to the information required to understand that Charles had refused the proposal. The official also had access to the process through which the revised paperwork moved. The overlap was becoming difficult to ignore. Charles now faced the possibility that the person who had used his authority had not acted randomly. The person may have understood the disagreement between William and Camilla and used that disagreement as an opportunity. That would explain why the missing objection mattered. William represented resistance. Camilla represented support for restructuring. Charles represented the final authority. Remove the resistance, manufacture the appearance of approval, and give the intended beneficiary a message saying the king had changed his mind. The entire process could then move forward while appearing legitimate from different angles. That was the most disturbing possibility yet, and it put Charles in an impossible position. If he publicly defended Camilla too quickly, critics could argue that the palace was protecting her. If he blamed her without waiting for the evidence, he could punish someone who may have been misled. If he blamed only the senior official, he still had to explain why the safeguards had failed. The king therefore chose a fourth option. He would allow the evidence to determine the outcome. That decision carried a personal cost. The investigation was now entering the private space of the royal family. Correspondence, staff relationships, confidential instructions, and conversations that would normally remain behind palace doors were becoming relevant to the case. Charles knew that once the process reached that stage, there would be no easy way to restore the old sense of security. Camilla knew it too. The person under investigation was no longer simply an unnamed official somewhere in the administrative system. The evidence was beginning to suggest that someone close enough to the royal family had understood exactly where the system was vulnerable. Then investigators reportedly found the strongest connection. Access records placed the senior official near the three critical points that had seemed unrelated at the beginning: the disputed royal authorization, William's missing objection, and the message telling Camilla that Charles had approved the proposal. That did not make every question disappear, but it transformed the investigation. The possibility of a coordinated manipulation was now much harder to dismiss. Charles had been asking who had used his name. William had been asking who removed his warning. Camilla had been asking who told her that the king had changed his mind. The same answer was beginning to emerge, and that was when Charles understood the real danger. The alleged forgery had not merely challenged his authority. It had exposed a weakness inside the machinery that carried his authority from one office to another. The next decision would determine whether that weakness remained hidden or became a public reckoning. Charles now had to decide what the country would hear, what consequences Camilla would face, and whether the crown would expose the full chain, even if doing so damaged the image of the royal family. Before that announcement, one final question remained. Would Charles protect the institution by protecting the people inside it, or would he protect the institution by exposing what had happened? If you believe no royal title should be powerful enough to bury the truth, do not stay silent now. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next part brings Charles's final announcement, and the consequences are far worse than the palace wanted anyone to see. The announcement was ready, but Charles still had one decision left to make. He could protect the palace from another damaging headline, or he could tell the public that the system around him had failed. The disputed decree had already raised questions about his authority, Camilla's judgment, William's warning, and the people trusted to protect the integrity of royal decisions. Now the king had to decide what would happen to all of them. According to the story, Charles chose accountability. The final review concluded that the disputed authorization had not been genuinely approved by him. The document could not stand as a valid expression of the king's decision. The process surrounding it had been compromised, and the evidence pointed toward deliberate manipulation inside the administrative chain. That finding answered the central question, but it did not make the scandal disappear. The senior official at the center of the investigation faced removal from the responsibilities connected to the disputed process. The person had been positioned close enough to critical records and communications to influence how the paperwork moved and how information reached the people involved. The consequences went beyond one official. The disputed arrangement was frozen, its authority was withdrawn. The missing objection connected to William was restored to the record. The approval process itself was subjected to tighter controls so that future decisions involving sensitive royal authority could not depend solely on paperwork moving between offices. The most important safeguard was direct authentication. A major decision could no longer rely on an assumption that the king had approved it. The person whose authority appeared on the document would have to confirm that authority through a secure process. That change carried an uncomfortable message. The old system had trusted the chain. Charles now had to trust the evidence. For Camilla, the conclusion was more complicated. The investigation did not establish that she had personally created the disputed authorization or ordered someone to forge Charles's approval, but that did not leave her untouched by the consequences. She had supported the underlying restructuring. She had continued to follow its progress, and she had accepted information claiming that Charles had changed his position without confirming that reversal with him directly. That was a serious failure of judgment. Charles could separate that failure from the alleged forgery, but he could not pretend the mistake had caused no damage. Her authority over the affected administrative area was therefore reduced, and the people around her who had been involved in the process faced greater scrutiny. For Charles, that distinction mattered. He was not announcing that Camilla had forged his name. He was announcing that the system had failed, that his authority had been improperly represented, and that nobody inside the royal family could expect loyalty to erase the consequences. William watched the final decision with a different understanding of his father. His original objection had been treated as part of the problem rather than an obstacle that could simply disappear. Once restored to the official record, it became evidence that the warning had existed before the disputed authorization ever appeared. That changed the meaning of William's role. He had not merely disagreed with Camilla, he had challenged a proposal that later became surrounded by suspicious paperwork. The final outcome, therefore, gave him something more important than vindication. It showed that his objection would remain part of the institutional record, even when the disagreement involved members of his own family. The public response was immediate. The story had moved beyond palace offices and parliamentary files. The controversy now concerned trust in the crown itself. Could a royal decision be trusted if the paperwork surrounding it could be manipulated? Could a senior official influence what the king believed, what the queen consort believed, and what the heir was allowed to see? And could the monarchy prove that family relationships did not place anyone beyond scrutiny? Charles's announcement had to answer those questions without turning the entire institution into another spectacle. He therefore presented the outcome as a matter of accountability. The disputed decree was not allowed to remain in force. The internal process was changed. The official at the center of the manipulation was removed from the relevant duties. Camilla's involvement was separated from the act of forgery, while her failure to verify the supposed reversal was acknowledged. William's objection remained on the record, and Charles accepted that the credibility of the crown depended on confronting the failure rather than hiding it. But the personal damage could not be repaired with a new procedure. Charles and Camilla had survived the immediate accusation, yet the question that had brought them into that private room remained between them. Trust had been tested. Camilla had to accept that wanting a decision to succeed could never replace the responsibility to verify it. Charles had to accept that the institution around him could fail even when he believed his instructions were clear. William had to accept that challenging his family could sometimes be necessary to protect the institution they all represented. That was the deeper consequence of the controversy. The disputed decree was only the visible object. The real danger was the possibility that people inside the system could exploit the distance between a decision and the paperwork used to represent it. If the allegations and evidence described in this story are taken seriously, that is why the case matters. It is not simply about a signature, it is about authority, it is about verification, and it is about what happens when people assume that a royal instruction cannot be manipulated because the institution itself is powerful enough to prevent it. Charles's final decision attempted to close that gap, but the damage had already exposed something the palace could not easily hide. A system built on trust still needs proof. A family built on loyalty still needs boundaries. And an institution built on authority still needs accountability. The king's announcement therefore became the final test. He could have allowed the controversy to remain a private dispute between officials. He could have defended Camilla without exposing the failures around her. He could have treated William's objection as an internal family disagreement and moved on. Instead, the decision forced the record to remain visible. That choice came at a cost. Camilla's authority was reduced. A senior official lost responsibility. William's concerns became part of the permanent account, and Charles was left knowing that his own name had been placed on a decision he said he never approved. For a monarch, that is more than an administrative embarrassment. It is a warning. The crown can survive criticism, it can survive gossip, it can survive political pressure. What it cannot easily survive is the belief that its authority can be copied, redirected, or concealed without consequence. That is why the final announcement matters within this story. Charles did not simply answer the question of who was responsible. He answered the larger question of what the monarchy would do when the problem reached inside its own walls. The answer was accountability, because once trust is damaged, every future royal assurance faces questions. And whether that decision is enough to repair the trust damaged by the controversy is a question that will remain long after the paperwork is filed away. If you believe powerful institutions should answer for what happens inside them, do not let this story disappear into silence. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Your support is how these stories remain visible instead of being buried when the next headline arrives. And stay close, because the next video coming to this channel goes even deeper into the royal controversy, and what emerges next could be far worse and far more revealing than this case.